Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Opportunities of Bioenergy and Biofuels in Developing Economies workshop. This is a joint undertaking from UNIDO and the IEA Bioenergy Technology Collaboration Program. As it indicates on your screen, this is the third of 3 sessions. And today we will be spending this afternoon on European time discussing sustainable biofuel production. My name is Gerard Ostheimer. I manage an activity under the Clean Energy Ministerial called the Biofuture campaign, which works to communicate to the governments of the ministerial the relevance and the importance of bio-based fuels, chemicals, and materials to the net zero energy transition. And we are very proud to partner with the TCP and with UNIDO on activities such as this. These workshops are serving a very important role in getting people to think, or getting more people to think more deeply of how we can expand the bioeconomy in the global south. And I think that these webinars will mark a taking off point for more active international engagement on the bioeconomy in the global south. So we are very happy to have 4 speakers today. I am joined as moderator by Ricardo Gorini from the International Renewable Energy Agency. Ricardo, would you like to introduce yourself, or would do that later?
Thank you, Gerard. Welcome, everybody. I think it's a pleasure also to be here. So my name is Ricardo Gorini. I'm here the head of the Renewable Energy Roadmaps at IRENA and the Bioenergy Program as well. So we do have also a lot of expectations on how we progress with the scale up of bioproduction. It's very crucial. As we all know, the outlook for 2030 and 2050, we would need to double or triple the amount of sustainable biofuel. So looking forward for the discussion. Welcome. So yes. So I think we have, as a warm-up, we would like to start with the poll. So I would like to ask you take a minute to fill this poll, max 3 selections, please. So let's see what will be the opportunity for you to address these 3 max, please, 3 max selections. Let's wait for a minute.
While you're filling out that poll, let me try to explain the way we like to run these sessions. We anticipate that many of you will have many questions. We prefer that you enter your question under the Q&A. So if you look at, there should be a bar somewhere on your screen that has the Q&A logo. Please use the Q&A to enter your questions. And feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, to communicate with your peers, to say hello to the group. But we greatly prefer that you use the Q&A for your questions. Are you seeing the poll results, Ricardo?
So we can see this, yes. So important, of course, is the bioethanol from sugar for road transport. That's very interesting. We also see an important role on bioethanol for sugar as clean cooking fuel. That's really a crucial use of bio as well. And I see also, as much as important, the biodiesel HVO from waste oil and crop. Yeah, and advanced biofuels. Yes, definitely. So looking forward for the discussions. So we will have another pool later on. So back to you, Gerard.
Thank you, Ricardo. And we will now go to Rainer Janssen from WIP Renewable Energies. Rainer is going to talk with us about unlocking the bioethanol economy. Very relevant given the immediate poll results, Rainer. So please take it away.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Gerard. You took my introduction. Can you hear me well? Okay, thank you. Yeah, so now it's my great pleasure to talk to you about unlocking the bioethanol economy, a pathway to inclusive and sustainable industrial development in developing countries. So you will hear now about the slight winners, and I believe that the reason for sugarcane-based ethanol for different applications to win these surveys, because it's around since a while, what 2030 and 2050 will give, and how many advanced technologies and how fast they will come to the market. This will still need to be seen. Okay, I'm trying to move. Good. So what I'm going to present to you today are the results of a recent study commissioned by UNIDO with the name and title of my presentation. This study was coordinated by Jossy Thomas from UNIDO, who is also in this call and who presented in session 1 of this workshop. The study team was led by Dina Bachowski, who is also one of the hosts of the current workshop from Best Austria, together with her colleague Doris Maczek and my colleagues Dominic Rutz and Benedetta Di Costanzo. I have included in this presentation, which I believe will be shared, the link to this study. It's a quite nice one, so don't be shy to download it after. So as an intro for my talk, basically, so as we all know, bioethanol is presently a global commodity, and I have shown a graph presenting the development of the global ethanol markets and also the outlook for the coming years. I would just want to highlight a number of issues on this slide. So first of all, in around the beginning of the century, there was about 40 billion liters of ethanol produced, and then you could see a steep increase to up to 100 billion liters up to the year 2010. Then actually the increase of global ethanol production is more bumpy, let me call it. You have the drop here with the pandemic, and what is also important to see is that actually this forecast doesn't really foresee a steep growth in ethanol production for the future. So in the introduction, Ricardo, you were mentioning doubling the production of biofuels by 2030, 2050. Most experts believe that it might not be a bioethanol, but still, of course, the produced volumes are huge. As we also know, the global bioethanol markets are dominated by the United States and Brazil, but there is also a number of other important players now: China, the European Union, Thailand, India, and Canada. And also there is an interesting, rather large bar which summarizes others, that indicates that bioethanol indeed is produced and used in a large number of countries worldwide. This slide gives you, and currently bioethanol is mainly used as a blending component in gasoline. So the use as clean cooking fuel is still rather limited. And the actually driver for blending ethanol in gasoline is mandates. And you can see here a global map showing that there is mandates all over the globe in quite a large number of countries. I will just name a few of emerging and developing economies. So there is E, and this E is basically the ethanol blending in gasoline, whereas B is the bioethanol, biodiesel blending, sorry, in diesel. So for India, we heard that for 2030, 2025 even, I think the mandate is now is E10 should be increased to be to E20 in the coming years. Then you have these blending mandates in countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, in Africa, in Ethiopia, Kenya, Mozambique, Malawi, South Africa, Angola, Sudan. And obviously in Brazil, the most prominent example, but also Uruguay, Argentina, Paraguay, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Panama. So a large number of countries are implementing bioethanol mandates for blending in gasoline. Bioethanol used as a cooking fuel in developing countries does also exist, but on a much smaller scale. We have, like the study here lists a number of countries which are implementing ethanol cooking programs: Ethiopia, Kenya, Brazil, Mozambique, Haiti, Madagascar, Nigeria, Tanzania. And actually, you've heard yesterday in the presentation by Jossy Thomas that UNIDO is currently rolling out an ethanol cook stove program in the city of Dar es Salaam, which would basically add to these figures for Tanzania in the future. So even at that stage, what are the barriers for use of bioethanol as a cooking fuel? So quite usually the ethanol is more expensive than other fuels, and that quite often is caused by subsidies for fossil fuels, especially for local use. Then obviously new cooking stoves would need an investment of households. Quite often the whole value and distribution chains need to be set up because this is a new fuel introduced to the market. And obviously there is also competing interests, so different fuels, for instance, that are promoted by governments. So how could these barriers be addressed? So obviously the cost issue by targeted subsidies, including microcredits, credit guarantees for households. Then the value chains basically need to be promoted on all different levels. And in general, you need a supportive regulatory environment, but I will come back to this later. Earlier in this workshop, we heard quite a bit on the benefits of bioenergy more general, and biofuels specifically here for transport and cooking. I will quickly repeat those. So with respect to environmental impacts, it is for the use as a cooking fuel, mainly the reduced indoor air pollution, but also reduced deforestation by illegal harvesting of firewood, and of course the climate change mitigation. On the social side, it is mainly about modern energy access. We heard numbers of people lacking access to energy in the session one yesterday, and also about job and value creation for the local populations. More broadly, in the economic fields, bioenergy, biofuels are meant to trigger investments in the agricultural sector, reduce the dependency of imported fossil fuels. That's a lesson we are currently learning with blood in Europe, as you all know from the news, and obviously industrial development and enhancement of the national GDP. I have prepared a few slides basically underlining the benefits of ethanol use. The first one is about the greenhouse gas emission reductions, which we urgently need to come down, follow like towards the possibly still reaching the Paris agreements, rather unlikely by the moment, and especially the transport sector is a hard to abate one, as we all know. So you can see here that the CO2 equivalent emissions in the gray bar, gasoline, and then different production method for bioethanol, one for sugarcane, then for corn and wheat. And we see a few things here. One is that the sugarcane-based bioethanol production has by far the best greenhouse gas production, greenhouse gas emission numbers. That is mainly caused by two factors. First is the high productivity of sugarcane per hectare. And the second one is that most facilities use renewable energies for their internal energy needs. Also, as we know, like with these emissions, there is land use change, indirect land use change impacts affected. So involved, and this is a matter of controversial discussions. Again, as we all know, what can be said is that indeed bioethanol, biofuels can reduce global emissions, but they will not reduce them to zero, like potentially other opportunities. With respect to cooking fuels, in reduction of indoor air pollution, we have also heard that quite a large number of people still use traditional biomass in very inefficient cooking places. You can see here that by improving this technology, the health aspects can be improved significantly. But in order to further improve, you would need to change the fuel towards alternatives as ethanol, biogas, and LPG, for instance. Best performance would be solar cookers, which have different issues here. One side remark here: when the IEA has sort of 1 or 2 years ago published their scenario for 2030, where it is anticipated that traditional use of biomass will be reduced to zero. Personally, I would like to discuss this. Is more complicated in an e-workshop, but I'm personally a little doubtful that this can be achieved to totally eliminate traditional biomass use, as much as would be wishful. But how basically to do that? So when talking about setting up bioethanol industries in developing countries, usually the example of Brazil is taken as a good and best practice. I'm rather sure we will hear more from Glaucia, the next speaker, in a few minutes. This is just a number of numbers underlining the actual big success and importance of the Brazilian ethanol program. As you can see in the graph, Brazil managed to become a net exporter of ethanol, so the dependency of petroleum is below zero now. In addition, the sugar and ethanol sector contributes by 2.4% to the GDP, and more than 2 million direct and indirect jobs are linked to the sugarcane and sugar sector in Brazil. So basically a strong argument of getting involved in industrial development in the bioethanol field. Gerard, I see your figure. I have lost the time. Actually, do I still have a few minutes? No.
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Maybe three more. No. I'm just proving I'm paying attention here. Maybe.
Very nice. No. I was getting a
maybe 3 more minutes would be perfect. But I checked your slides. You're making good progress.
Okay. No. Many thanks. I'm always a little scared. And now with online, it's even worse. So. Okay. So actually, to start developing, promoting an ethanol industry in developing countries, there is quite a number of challenges, and I would urge you again to have a look at the full study to get some detailed information here. I will not go through these tables one by one, but I will just pick a few issues. So a challenge is, of course, is there an effect on food availability and food prices? This is debated. What should be done certainly is to monitor potential impacts on food security and to balance incentives if needed with respect, like if there any impact is monitored. I would now move to the second side. Basically, a challenge is quite often or let's say there is the criticism that maybe it is more foreign investors that benefit from such introduction of bioethanol. So how can it be ensured that the local population gets a fair share of the added value and the value chains? So some of the strategies is so-called local content requirements that can be implemented when setting up regulations. Outgrower schemes involving small farmers are an important option. And then obviously all the issues about research and innovation on national and local level, education, capacity building would strengthen local society. Quite like the lack of investment is an important challenge also for the development of all forms of bioenergy. So what is needed is a clear framework for investors, including policies. I will come back to that later. Access to credits, to loan guarantees, tailor-made financing schemes to support large-scale industries and local SMEs, and also social financing schemes. Quite often, as mentioned before, the production price for ethanol is higher than the current fuels for transport and cooking. What can be done here is work with tax exemptions, or alternatively remove or decrease fossil fuel subsidies. But again, like the reason to have these subsidies is to keep the costs for the local population low. So that is a delicate topic, of course. Finally, there is a negative, quite often the negative public perception on biofuels due to issues like land grabbing, land use change, inappropriate project planning, a number of bad examples from the past. And so when setting up such promotion programs, early safeguards and close monitoring needs to be implemented during the implementation to avoid all possible negative impacts. Basically, what is needed to establish an enabling framework for the bioethanol industry? And so what is this graph is a little complicated, and indeed to establish a bioethanol industry in any country is a complicated and delicate and intricate endeavor, which mainly relies on three pillars, which are shown also in the graph. So what is needed is
Rainer, sorry, could we come back to this during the questions? I think we need to zip through, but we'll come back to this after you finish.
Oh, please. No, I'm open for questions.
Yeah, so if you could just get to your last few slides, and we can leave it to people to follow this.
For sure. No, thank you. So a few words just to give so what is needed is an enabling government framework. Then, of course, the government shouldn't do it all. You need private sector engagement and access to finance, and you need to establish markets for ethanol, either through blending targets or for cooking. On the environmental government framework, what is important is that each country needs to define clear development priorities. So why is it doing it? Is it for energy dependence? Is it for job creation? Is it for health? This is important. There should be protection of national bioethanol industries, and then a number of policies in agriculture, environment, innovation, energy need to be complementing each other and in place to facilitate this enabling government framework. It also needs to be clear that a feasibility analysis on potential biofuel crops is done, and then issues like food security, land use rights, and all that are taken care of. In order to promote the private sector to join, usually it is building upon existing industries in the agricultural sector, for instance. So those need to be promoted. And in addition, it needs to be ensured that outgrowers would be able to join in order to have a value distribution among the population. On the market, Private sector will only get involved if the market is stable and secure. Mandates are a possibility, but also programs for cooking fuel. So basically, I have two more slides summarizing recommendations. I would not read them because most of them were already mentioned during my talk. Gerard, would that be a?
That's perfect. I think that I will have a look at those as we get ready for the questions, but to be in deference for our other speakers, I think I'm going to hand over to Ricardo. Thank you very much. Congratulations on the report.
Thank you.
I think that maybe people could put that as a link in the chat right now, and I think this will be an important resource going forward. Ricardo, if you would.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Thank you, Rainer.
All the best, Glaucia.
Thank you. So now I would like to invite the second speaker, Dr. Glaucia Souza. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for joining us today. Dr. Glaucia is a full professor of the Institute of Chemistry in the University of São Paulo in Brazil. So with plenty of experience on the research field of bioenergy, on FAPESP Bioenergy Research Program, and as well on several international corporations like IEA Bioenergy, GBAP, Biofuture platform. So thank you for joining us today. And Dr. Glaucia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning to all from Brazil. So I will try to give you an overview of the work of the Brazilian team from the FAPESP Bioenergy Research Program BIOEN on biofuels in emerging markets, conducted in IEA Bioenergy Task 39. This is work that has been recently summarized in a policy brief. And this is the first time that we present the first phase conclusions and launch this document. So I'd like to give my thanks to both IEA Task 39, the EXCO committee, and BIOEN for their help and opportunity to present here. We first started by
just a question. Would you like to share the screen? Are you sharing the?
I am sharing
slides?
the screen. You cannot see?
Just checking if maybe it's with my problem.
You cannot see my
connection.
sharing?
Gerard, can you see this the slides?
Not yet, Glaucia.
Not yet, right? Okay.
No?
No.
Okay, then I try again. Just a second. Can you see now?
Looks good.
Oh, okay. So, all right. So, yes. So the policy brief that I was mentioning is available on this website. This in an evaluation of emerging economies, we started by evaluating biofuel blending mandates across the global south and classified countries according to their current biofuel policies into three categories: fully implemented in blue, partially implemented mandate in green, or just the legal framework in place, SALMA. Then we chose developing countries with large populations with high energy demand and biofuels policies in place to conduct a life cycle assessment and a techno-economic analysis of yields, conversion processes, emissions in all phases, feedstock costs, price of co-products, and market conditions. Based on the results of LCA and TEA, we can look into different scenarios of blending mandates, determine economic and environmental feasibility, estimate the GHG savings, the required land to produce biofuels, and the fuel costs. In the first phase of the project, we evaluated Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Guatemala, where biofuels are fully deployed, technologies have reached high TRL. We concluded that in all cases for both ethanol and biodiesel from corn, sugarcane, soybean, and palm, processes presented a positive energy balance. They are competitive with fossil fuel prices. They contribute with significant reductions in emissions. And we verify the potential to double production using very little pasture land. We are now in the second phase of this project, evaluating China, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Africa, and Thailand. But let me take you through some of the data. So for Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Guatemala, GHG reduction from 66 to 74% was observed for ethanol in relation to gasoline produced from sugarcane, while corn ethanol produced in Argentina presented an approximate reduction of 37%. And the difference being that natural gas is being used in the alcohol plant in the case of corn, while sugarcane bagasse is being used for cogeneration of electricity and heat in the sugarcane case. For biodiesel, either from soybean or palm, we also see large reduction in GHG emissions. It's important to note that in all these processes, we also have food and feed products produced in parallel. In the case of biodiesel, we have soybean meal, palm, we have kernel products, sugarcane, we have sugar, corn, we have distillers grain, which contribute to the full utilization of biomass. And bioelectricity is increasingly being exported to the grid. In Brazil, we have the Renova Bio policy framework. This is how it looks like with all its agents, documents, actions, and tools. It was designed to aid the country in achieving its commitments in the Paris Agreement by rewarding producers that can demonstrate their biofuels are mitigating emissions. At the heart of the policy framework, we have a calculator. It's an LCA calculator called Renova Calc. It uses a third-party certification party to award decarbonization credits called CBIOS to biofuel producers and importers that are negotiated in the stock market. In 2022, 31 million CBIOS were issued, each corresponding to a ton of avoided CO2 emissions. In these tables here, we show the results obtained if all 4 countries adopted a low carbon fuel policy, such as the Brazilian Renova Bio. So it was an exercise to look at the impact. The ethanol production for Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia represents a reduction of 52, 68, and 74% in total emissions compared with gasoline. Due to political issues, Guatemala has not adopted blend mandates for biofuels, and policymakers have already discussed this possibility. They are only exporting now. If Guatemala implemented a similar public policy, the country would cut GHG emissions by 67% by replacing gasoline with ethanol. And considering biodiesel production, a potential reduction of emissions of 78, 66, 83% when diesel was replaced by biodiesel in Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia, respectively, is estimated every year, okay? having a policy that rewards biofuels reductions in emissions would create a market, would reward with revenues in the order of $600 million every year. So this is an example of the economic impact that could be created and possibly the creation of innovation cycles to improve even further these gains. So what is the potential for expansion? Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Guatemala provide 29% of the global ethanol and 24% of the global biodiesel, and 97% of Latin America's biofuels. So this is an industry that is already very well established. An important aspect is to verify land availability for expansion. So the circles below the flags show the relative sizes of these countries. The arc shows the amount of land used for food in salmon, for pasture in orange, for biofuels in blue and green. So this is the share of land that biofuels, with all this contribution that they are being able to achieve, are using in these countries. It's very little land that's being used, and look at how much pasture land we still have available that could be used. This has, to duplicate biofuels production, we estimate that a small fraction of each of these countries' pasture land could be used. These are the numbers here. This ranges from 0.1 to 10% of pasture land needed. There is already ongoing intensification of herding taking place, and there is an added benefit of conversion of pasture land into energy crops, of increasing soil carbon, as well as jobs and revenues. Our motivation comes from this first study that we did with Trindade et al. In 2019, where we looked at the amount of pasture land available in all these countries in Latin America and the Caribbean and Southern Africa. These are used inefficiently and could be used to grow energy crops with a 2 to 3 years payback time for significant reductions of emissions. I think with only 1% of pasture and current sugarcane yields, we could achieve quite a lot of reductions and open up new markets in these regions. So just to finish, this is the work that we are conducting now, analyzing biofuels in China, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Africa, and Thailand. Here in these graphs, we have the results of life cycle assessment on the left, what we obtained so far. We are looking into human toxicity, terrestrial acidification, fossil resource scarcity, and global warming potential. And to the right, you can see in the case of this first three impact, to the left still, you can see that in the first three categories, we have been able to point out points where there could be improvements, such as in South Africa, where they are using coal to power some of the activities in the ethanol plant. But to the right, you can see that in comparison to fossil fuels, all of the cases throughout these technologies would be able to decrease significantly emissions. We are working now on blending mandate scenarios. In our market analysis, we are considering two of them that are more feasible. and one of them that will represent a hypothetical case in which biofuels represent at least 1/4 of the fuel markets. This in terms of energy content, not volume. You can see here in these graphs that the land required to produce biofuel, which is in the bottom for the 5 to 10% blends in these countries, is not a lot, is in the order of 2 to 3%, sometimes even less. So this is a very feasible scenario. A lot of this land could be coming from pasture lands for many of the countries except Malaysia. And now we are deepening our analysis to look into biodiversity and the impact that could come, the indirect impacts on deforestation, because we are aware that this could be an issue. So I think this was most of what I had to tell you today. I'll be glad to answer some questions, and this is work in progress. We have a lot of interest in contacting local industries to gather data and have access to the real conditions for application of these tools. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Glaucia. Really very, very interesting numbers and a lot of expectation on that, and hope we can have soon more about this kind of analysis. That's very, very useful. So thank you for that. I think we have few minutes left. Just one clarification questions. Maybe one that I think is interesting here. There is a question from Herma 1 that is there any country using multi-feedstocks for biofuel production, and how they control the supply? So yeah, maybe if you'd like to answer to this.
So we haven't had time yet to look into the data, but there has been studies already on life cycle analysis of flexible meals that can use either corn or sugarcane in combination. I'd like to mention that, for instance, in Brazil, we have already a significant growth of corn being produced as a second cropping without the need of added fertilization in Brazil. This is probably going to reach 6 billion liters soon. So there is, I think, the possibility that this will add to the array of different feedstocks that we have. We have already plants that are using bagasse for second generation, integrated with first generation as well. So you bring in residues. And in TAS 39, we have projects that are looking at co-processing of different feedstocks for bio-oil, for bio-kerosene production. So this is ongoing work. I think we could share some data if needed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Please, Gerard, back to you.
Thank you, Ricardo. So now we move on to our third speaker, or in this case, speakers. We are joined by Robert Malina of Hasselt University. Robert is a full professor of environmental economics, and his co-author, I believe, Megersa Abate from the World Bank. Megersa is a transport economist at the bank and a global co-lead for the aviation solution area. The title of their presentation is SAF Production Challenges and Opportunities in Developing Countries. I see that the slides are coming up. So Robert and Megersa, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just quickly confirm that I can be heard.
Yes.
Okay.
And
great.
slides are seen.
Perfect. Perfect. Then good afternoon from Belgium. My colleague Megersa from the World Bank and we will be talking about a recently published flagship report by the World Bank group called The Role of Sustainable Aviation Fuels in Decarbonizing Air Transport. This is joint work with Charles Schlumberger from the World Bank and Freddie Navarro from Hasselt University. And we'll zoom in particular today on the challenges and opportunities for SAF in developing countries. Given that this is the first SAF presentation of the afternoon, I thought it might make sense to quickly talk about sustainable aviation fuel and what that actually is, because it is an umbrella term, and to be fair, a made-up umbrella term for a wide variety of pathways to convert any feedstock of biological origin and waste fossil carbon into a liquid fuel that is chemically similar enough to be blended with conventional jet fuel, and that this blended final product can then be used with the existing fuel infrastructure, both at the airport and in the aircraft, and then finally can just be combusted in an aircraft engine like conventional jet fuel. At this point, we have some blending limits. Usually they are 50% blend limits. For some pathways, it is a bit lower. In the future, there's an expectation that we can go up to 100% SAF, so that neat SAF can be used without any blending requirements. There have been test flights for that, and new engines that will come online will be certified for 100% SAF usage as well. So sustainable aviation fuels are interesting from an environmental perspective because of their potential life cycle greenhouse gas emission benefits. But please keep in mind that the magnitude of the benefits or the existence of the benefits even is feedstock and conversion pathway specific. So the photo shown here on the slide was actually taken at the ICAO assembly last year, and it shows the different, or a set of different oily and fatty feedstocks that can be used for SAF production. And just from looking at the color, you can actually see the heterogeneity in this feedstock. But this heterogeneity on this photo is actually only, part of the full heterogeneity. And I think this becomes clear in this chart here, where, we acknowledge that oil and fats are a critical group of feedstocks to produce SAF, but they're not the only ones. So this chart here depicts the different SAF production routes that are currently certified for use in jet engines. So they have all so-called ASTM certifications, plus the associated feedstocks. And those are shown here on the left. And the feedstock variety is wide, encompassing the before mentioned fats, oils, and greases, but it also includes vegetable oils, oily cover crops, sugary, starchy, and lignocellulosic biomass, crop and forestry residues, municipal solid waste, microalgae, macroalgae, different types of feedstocks. And this feedstock breadth is relevant to mention here, as it implies that feedstock production for SAF is not constrained to a limited set of biomass that is amenable to certain locations or climates only. So turning to the key findings of our report, we would like to highlight 5 key messages. The first one is that SAF will need to play a major role in the decarbonization mix. It is the only option that can generate significant greenhouse gas emission reductions in the medium term already. The second core message is that current SAF production plans are dominated by OECD locations, which means that developing countries are missing out on significant economic, environmental, and social benefits of SAF production. We'll go into greater detail on this aspect later on in our presentation. The third key message is that SAF production can reduce up to 58% of aviation CO2 emissions compared to business as usual in 2050, according to our simulations. And this will require significant policy support, obviously even more so in developing countries. Fourth key message is that the required investment for the scale-up is high, but it's actually comparable to current and historical investments in other energy sectors. So investments are high, but they're not unprecedented. And then lastly, with regard to the costs of abatement, these abatement costs of SAF in the year 2030 can be below $100 per ton of CO2e for some highly mature and greenhouse gas beneficial pathways. And by 2050, that's the end of our time horizon in this study, And under the assumption of aggressive policies for mitigating climate change, up to that point, large volumes of SAF could be provided at below zero or close to zero abatement costs. So let's zoom in on developing countries. And this is a map here, courtesy of the ICAO Secretariat in Montreal, which tracks SAF deployment at airports globally. And in this map, bigger volumes are indicated by the red dots. So not the size of the dots, they're all the same size, but the color of the dots. So red dots are the ones where you have ongoing deliveries at an airport, whereas the orange ones are the ones where only batches have been delivered. That can be one batch, that can be several batches, but that means that these airports, the orange ones, there's no continuous deployment of SAF into aircraft. From the location of the dots in general, and the red ones in particular, we can take away that current SAF deployment is concentrated in the United States and in Europe. In our report, we try to look into the future of SAF production out to 2025. And so we analyzed announced SAF production capacity out to that year for different uptake scenarios. And across all the scenarios, we find that developing countries are underrepresented in the short-term SAF production plans, with roughly 90% of SAF production located in OECD countries. And please note that our studies was published nine months ago, so the data is probably a year ago or 12 months ago. So any announcements between a year ago and now have not been included in this data. But from what we've seen come online and become public is that the trend of underrepresentation of developing and emerging economies has not changed. The lack of SAF production in non-OECD countries is not due to a lack of feedstocks. So a high-level analysis that we used in our study finds that there is significant feedstock potential, with 2/3 of this not competing with food sources. And that's also not a new trend, because you have to keep in mind that, for example, that 50% of current biodiesel feedstock in Europe currently comes from developing countries. So this is obviously not refined biodiesel, it's the feedstock that's being imported to Europe, but that implies that feedstock in developing countries is already used at this point. In our report, we investigate the main barriers that have been identified for SAF deployment in developing countries, and we do that actually by leveraging a wide set of recent feasibility studies, because there have been some, well, not deep dives, but real feasibility studies for a set of countries, often commissioned by ICAO, but also commissioned by other players. And I believe we will touch upon one specific country case in the next presentation that comes after us, which deals with SAF potential in South Africa. And while there are many hurdles to overcome for SAF production in developing countries, we single out one specific one here with the quote on the right, which comes from a previous World Bank report. And that quote says that the challenge of the low carbon transition starts with tackling the chronic lack of financing for productive investments that plagues most developing countries, and the need to find new sources of financing and to leverage existing ones. And the lack of financing for productive investments is a real issue for SAF as well, because these plans are often very capital intensive. And we have an example here on this slide. So one actually relatively small 2,000 barrels per day municipal solid waste Fischer-Tropsch plant requires a capital investment that is the same as the investment needs for a major new transport corridor from the Ivory Coast to Burkina Faso, and is the same as the investment need for a major hydropower project in East Africa. Financing in developing countries is in particular difficult because of the high risk premiums involved that drive up the cost of capital and the expected rate of return. What you see in this graph here is the difference in the minimum fuel selling price, or MSP, when a SAF plant is located in Europe or the US, so that's the blue bar, compared to an average developing country, that is the orange bar. And you can see that depending on the pathway and the feedstock, SAF in developing countries would be 14 to 38% more expensive to produce than in Europe or the US. And this here is purely due to the higher risk premiums for both equity and debt assumed, which indicates the major importance of driving down these risk premiums. But even if we manage to drive down the risk premiums to an average OECD level, there is still a cost gap with conventional jet fuel to make up for. And this is often called the green premium to indicate that SAF is more expensive on the one hand, while on the other hand, delivering greenhouse gas benefits. And you can see the green premium in this chart to the right of the vertical blue dotted line, which is the current conventional jet fuel price, around 60 cents per liter. Well, that's the world average from April 2023. And that's actually the only change we made to the previous chart we've shown you. So this green premium is substantial, and it can easily add millions, if not hundreds of millions, to the fuel bill of an airline. Shouldering this green premium is a particular challenge in developing countries where many local carriers are short on cash. So we believe that coalitions will be needed to drive down risk premiums and distribute the green premium. And these coalitions will need to be specific for each SAF investment case in a specific country. This coalition will need to include financing agreements with international development banks and offtake agreements from airlines, with uplift commitments needing to come from major international airlines in particular, because of their usually better financial situation. There might also be an interesting role to be played by corporates that are interested in claiming SAF Scope 3 credits for their own emission reduction ambitions or science-based targets. And that's a real opportunity for aviation here, which has a lot of corporate travel, and actually a limited set of corporations account for a relatively high share of this corporate travel, and they can be specifically targeted. We see more and more of these purchases in Europe and the US, and there are big corporations based in developing countries that have the financial resources and ambitions to get involved here as well. And finally, the coalition will obviously require government commitments, not only from the local governments, but also from governments with a more developed SAF market for sharing expertise and best practices. And there are different players currently active in building such coalitions. That is the World Bank, but that is also the US Federal Aviation Administration, that is Germany's GIZ, that is the French government, many other players. And that obviously is an encouraging development. And I will hand it over now to Megersa, who will briefly touch on the World Bank's portfolio on this and will lead us then to the end of this presentation.
Thank you, Robert. Now, let me quickly talk about our ongoing activities related to air transport decarbonization. So building on the report Robert talked about earlier, we are looking into going to deeper analysis in case countries. So we've got a knowledge activity. We consider ourselves as a knowledge bank and also an investment bank for sure. So on the knowledge side, we have a couple of analytical products in the pipeline. One is this decarbonizing aviation through the scale up of SAF. And this has 4 components in it. First will be a country and regional deep dives. We've got a few countries as an initial pilot: Kenya, Colombia, India, and Zambia, where we are looking deeply into how these countries can join the SAF value chain. Component 2 will focus on support for the ICAO under the ACT SAF initiative, supporting countries in their long-term aspirational goals to achieve net zero aviation by mid-century. We are also partnering and forming these coalitions just mentioned by Robert with the private sector and the US Federal Aviation Administration and others to support our client countries. Finally, we are also looking into how we can fill the gap in financing for SAF, which is not an easy task. for many of our client countries who already face a lot of development challenges to finance their transport sector. Another knowledge product in the pipeline from our side is a GHG accounting guidance note for our air transport sector investments. Some MDBs already have this. In particular, EIB has a guidance note on how to account for emissions from air transport sector. On the investment side, our private sector arm, IFC, has a couple of active projects that they are looking into, one in the Southern American region and another in Kenya. And we are comparing notes with them and supporting them in some of these activities. At the bank, we are at early stage. As I said, the deep dive analysis are what we are looking into. Next slide, please. But more generally, the World Bank has set up the Global Facility to Decarbonize Transport, GFDT, to support its client countries. Just as a quick reminder, developing countries face a transport financing gap of up to $944 billion annually. This is a somewhat dated study, maybe it's $1 trillion by now. And the World Bank has set up this trust fund to support its countries. And our support will cover 3 areas: project design and implementation, research and data, and capacity building. Our ambition under this facility is to raise up to $200 million over 10 years period to invest in low carbon transport solutions. So far, with the support of sovereign governments from the Netherlands, Germany, Luxembourg, and the UK, we have raised about $10 million, but these are mostly for other sectors within the transport area. We are yet to raise any aviation specific funding, but efforts are underway to support our client countries. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Megersa. I'll hand it back to the moderators now.
Yes, perfect, Robert and Megersa. We're already past the hour, and we're going to be having a panel discussion later. So I think that we will just move on to our next speaker and anticipate questions for all of you at the end of the fourth talk. Ricardo?
Thank you. So now we would like to ask to bring us the presentation from Dr. Farai Chireshe. Hope I pronounced correctly your name, but yeah. So thank you for joining us today as well. So Dr. Farai is energy analyst and project officer at WWF South Africa, and has a focus on technology, advance and climate change mitigation adaptation. So it's good also to have you here with us, and thank you for joining us today. So we'd like to have 15 minutes, please, presentation. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm coming to you from Cape Town in South Africa. Please just confirm if you can hear me and you can see my slides, please.
Yes, perfect. We can hear you and see you. Yeah, please go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. This afternoon, I'm going to share with you some of the work that we've done on as WWF, the opportunities for sustainable aviation fuel production with a specific focus in South Africa. We have done this work and the support by a number of research organizations based here in South Africa, Stellenbosch University, the Center of Scientific and Industrial Research, CSIR, and Imperial Managed Solutions. I think the starting point for this work as WWF was on the basis of the acknowledgement of the climate impact of aviation, knowing that it accounts for 2 to 3% of global carbon dioxide emissions or CO2 emissions. And if we know that if we are to account the non-CO2 emissions, this number would actually double to about 5% or so. And without any mitigation, this CO2 impact could increase to account for over 22% of all man-made CO2 emissions. And in the South African case specifically, civil aviation accounts for about 8% of total transport CO2 emissions, so it is quite significant. And because of South Africa's geographic positioning, so on the other side of the world, on the southern side, in the southern hemisphere, and one of our key income earners being tourism, one of the risks that has been identified by the country's Presidential Climate Commission was that tourism could be impacted as climate conscious travel, as travelers become climate conscious. So there's a need to address the aviation component. So, and then I think finally, in terms of the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, transport-related emissions will at some point be taken into account. And then this will obviously impact any exports that are coming from South Africa using air travel. And as the previous speakers have given previously, sustainable aviation fuels, or SAF, are expected to play a key role in decarbonization of the aviation sector. I'm not going to go again to describe what sustainable aviation fuel is. I think the previous speakers have done a fantastic job at that. I'm going to try to answer the question why South Africa specifically should look at this opportunity. I think the first one is an excellent resource base. There are a number of feedstocks that can be used to produce sustainable aviation fuels in the different pathways. And the country also has long-standing experiences with promising technologies for producing SAF, including most notably the Fischer-Tropsch process, which is used by Sasol at present to produce jet fuel from coal. And also we have another company, Petro SA, which has Fischer-Tropsch capabilities. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's a need to start decarbonizing South Africa's carbon aviation sector. Another big thing why South Africa is looking into it is the export opportunity that producing sustainable aviation fuel is. There's a global demand for SAF at the moment, and South Africa could be in a position to meet this need. Also interestingly, so South Africa at this moment, besides the jet fuel that is produced by Sasol from coal, we import most of the rest of our jet fuel from refineries elsewhere. And there have been issues where one of the local airports at Cape Town was facing fuel shortages due to supply chain issues. So producing SAF locally would be able to address some of these supply chain issues. So I'm going to take, in terms of the feedstock that is available for producing sustainable aviation fuel in South Africa, we looked at five feedstock, as you can see on the screen. The first one there is Solaris tobacco, or tobacco seeds, a variation of tobacco seeds. This was based on the previous work that we did, that was done for WWF by by IASA from Vienna, looking at the potential of growing different biofuel or bioenergy crops in sub-Saharan Africa. And from the South African case, we saw that the crop that had the highest potential to produce aviation fuels, taking into account land required for food, as well as taking into account protected lands and protected areas, as well as the future demand for food and agriculture and other agricultural purposes. There could be a potential to produce about 5.2 million tons of Solaris seeds per annum. The other potential feedstocks to look at is sugarcane molasses, the byproduct of the sugar making process. So in South Africa currently, a lot of the sugar that is being exported or sold on the international market is being sold at a loss. And therefore, the industry is looking at how to utilize that excess feedstock to alternative products, and sustainable aviation fuels is one of those opportunities. Another opportunity are industrial off-gases from the ferroalloy sector. So South Africa is a huge ferrochrome producer, and in the processing of such in such processes, a lot of carbon monoxide rich off-gases are produced, and these are often flared without energy recovery. So there's a potential to use those off gases for self-production. The biggest opportunity or feedstock available for self-production in South Africa are cleared invasive alien plants, or IAPs, and I'll speak to those on the next slide. Also to note that there is garden waste. We were able to identify that there's about 170,000 tons per annum of garden waste in Johannesburg and the Eden District Municipality in the southern parts of South Africa. So this is not to say that there is no other garden waste in South Africa. It's just that obtaining this data from the municipalities is a bit tricky, and not all of the municipalities take in or have a sound recording mechanism. So we're not able to get data to put and use into this study. I mentioned previously that invasive alien plants are the ideal feedstock of South Africa. So when you're talking about invasive alien plants or invasive alien trees, these are essentially non-indigenous trees in South Africa that were mostly used for forestry and timber. So you're talking about eucalyptus, wattles, and pines. So what you've seen is they've outgrown their dedicated forest areas, and they've started to expand beyond those, going into the indigenous ecosystems. And they are known and noted to be a threat to biodiversity, to water security, because they do consume a lot of water, and of course affect productive use of land as well as the ecological function of ecosystems. So it's because of these reasons that, according to South African law, the removal of IAPs is mandated. If you're a landowner, you must clear your invasive alien trees from your land. But there are challenges to that. Currently, the rate of clearing is quite slow, and you see that where they've cleared the trees, as you can see in that picture, there isn't any large-scale uptake of the biomass. So most of this biomass is left in the natural forest, in the landscape, and it becomes a significant fire hazard. So what they do sometimes to prevent these fires is to do controlled burning. And therefore, you actually burn these trees without valorization of any kind. On the right of the page, you will see a map of the Western Cape province in South Africa, showing the distribution of the invasive alien plants. You will see that their distribution is quite sporadic. So there are challenges in setting up supply chains and making sure that you have enough biomass to support an economically viable facility. So in our work, we try to look at doing supply chain optimization to see where can we place these facilities so that it is economical for self-production in South Africa. So overall approach to this was to do a feedstock selection, as I've spoken about feedstock in the previous slide. And we also looked at a number of different self-production processes, focused mainly on the hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids, or HEFA, the alcohol to jet, A to J, and then looked at two Fischer-Tropsch pathways, one Fischer-Tropsch synthetic paraffinic kerosene, FT-SPKA, as well as FT-SPK with aromatics. We also looked at IH2, so integrated hydropyrolysis and hydroconversion. On the slide, you see the different pathways that we looked at for self-production in South Africa. So the first three pathways use different feedstocks, the tobacco seeds, the sugarcane, air molasses, and the waste gases. And for pathways 4 onwards, those were pathways that were competing for the different types of feedstocks. So considering the Fischer-Tropsch pathways and the A to J facilities. And you see that in some of and what we did was to, I mentioned earlier, a network optimization, kind of a center of gravity analysis to see where would be the ideal location of these facilities in relation to the location of the feedstock. So ideally placing the feedstocks in areas of, placing the facilities in areas of high feedstocks densities. So we set our different supply chains such that you have a primary transport of your raw feedstock from the source to an intermediate processing facility. at which an intermediate product, such as vegetable oil for the HEFA process, or ethanol for alcohol to jet, or even syncrude for an Fischer-Tropsch facility, is produced, and then that secondary product is then transported to a final processing facility. So the reason why I consider the supply chains is so as to limit the transport of biomass. So biomass is quite bulky, and ideally you want to locate your facilities as close as possible to the feedstock, and also by aggregating feedstock from your intermediate processing facility, you're able to benefit from economies of scale at your final processing plant. So in this, we also included the transport costing, how much it would transport the feedstock across the different phases of transport, primary and secondary, and then afterwards we then looked at the self-production potential and cost per facility. With that, we then totalized or aggregated this to come up with a national self-production potential. Interesting to also look at different scenarios, one for energy self-sufficiency. So this is the area where some of the biomass is used for either electricity generation or green hydrogen or hydrogen production for the refining stages. And you also looked at the case where you would actually import external or renewable energy for green hydrogen production. And in our analysis, the pathway 6A, you can just take note of that, was the one that was most economical. And this is when I'm looking and I'm referring to the lignocellulosic or invasive alien plant-based pathways. That is the pathway that I'll be referring to. In terms of the results, they're presented on the graph shown on your screen. For the hydrogen scenario, we looked at two bands. There's two scenarios where you have a green hydrogen price of a high green hydrogen price of around $4.4 per kilogram, as well as a low hydrogen price of $2 per kilogram. And what we generally saw with the results was that the external energy scenario where you use external green hydrogen is generally more cost effective than self-sufficiency scenario. That was more cost effective than the self-sufficiency scenario. And of course, the cost of hydrogen plays a big role in this. What is seen from our analysis was using green hydrogen together with the green molecules from the biomass is actually advantageous because in typical self-sufficient refining processes, some of that carbon is used for hydrogen production. So in the Fischer-Tropsch process, as an example, the hydrogen requirements are produced through the so-called water gas shift reaction, where once the biomass is gasified to produce carbon monoxide and hydrogen, it is then undergoes through a water gas shift reaction to produce additional hydrogen, producing and converting some of the carbon monoxide to CO2. So in that case, you waste CO2 molecules, and introducing green hydrogen will serve the purpose of making sure that your green carbon goes quite far. And from that analysis, you'd see that using sugarcane-based ethanol is the least cost pathway in South Africa for producing sustainable aviation fuels.
Please, Farai, just let's try to summarize.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Sure. So overall, South Africa has the potential to produce 3.2 to 4.5 billion liters of SAF, depending on whether it's a self-sufficient or external energy scenarios. Most of the SAF production happens in the northeast of the country, close to OR Tambo International Airport in Johannesburg, which consumes about 65% of the joint consumption in South Africa. Pre-COVID, South Africa was consuming about 2.5 billion liters of SAF. So this is enough to meet current demands and possibly going into the near future as well. And I think it's another significant opportunity for South Africa is using brownfield facilities for producing sustainable aviation fuels. So existing refineries So tapping into, for example, using SASO's facilities for core processing, using invasive alien plants, or using some of the conventional petrochemical refineries for processing lipid-based feedstocks, or for using sugarcane-based ethanol. So this is the opportunity to reduce the SAF production costs. I think as some of my panelists have mentioned earlier, I think there's a significant socioeconomic impacts from the biofuels industry. It's the same for SAF as well, with the potential to contribute to 40,000 direct jobs, as well as 19,700 agricultural jobs from growing Solaris. Also looking just the transport leg also is quite significant. If you're looking at transporting lignocellulosic biomass, or the clad invasive alien plants, and the garden waste, you're talking about 4,800 jobs nationally. So significant opportunity there. So just from the key takeaways, huge employment opportunity for across the value chain, and I think this industry is also quite placed in a good position to go hand in hand in growing South Africa's green hydrogen economy. With that, I'd just like to close off with some recommendations to facilitate self-development in South Africa. As my fellow panelists have mentioned, I think policy certainty is key to grow this SAF industry, and the key step in that is development of a SAF roadmap to say how we're going to move forward in developing this industry. And it would need various stakeholders, from government, from feedstock producers, to airlines, to civil society, people on the ground developing the supply chains to come and work on this together. From the work that we've done, some of the pathways are already cost competitive with SAF, and several more could become more cost competitive with minor policy support, which could include ways to farmer support to lower feedstock costs, and we can also look at implementing measures to lower cost of capital. Could be subsidies, concessional finance, or reducing the risks associated with the investment, as been mentioned earlier. And I think a key thing here is to ensure that strict sustainability principles are incorporated to ensure environmental benefits are realized. So in the work that we've done, and you can see this in the extra slides when they are shared after this webinar, all the SAF pathways that we've analyzed according to the strict sustainability principles of the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials, or RSB. And I think that is quite critical before developing an industry that could be big as SAF, because if done right, there could be significant environmental impacts. I think in the South African case, there's quite the need to demonstrate the feasibility of complex invasive alien plant to SAF supply chains. How do we link to existing alien clearing activities to actually see that this is feasible? Yes, there's been some clearing happening at smaller scale. When you start about developing plants, SAF plants, this has to be done much larger. And of course, I think making use of existing refinery infrastructure is one of the quickest and cheapest way to start producing SAF. And there's an opportunity to grow the bioeconomy with the green hydrogen economy. Tapping into the synergies between the two can lead to reduced product costs, and ultimately, this is what we all want. So,
thank you.
Yeah, there's some publications, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Farai. We will have opportunity to discuss further soon. So, thank you very much for this comprehensive presentation. I just, please, Gerard, take the floor. Yeah. So we can
okay.
Go on with.
Sure. If we had an auditorium, I would ask for applause for all of our speakers. An enormous amount of information, as has been indicated. The slides will be made available online through the IEA website, and I think there will be opportunities for further communication with the authors. It's time for our second poll. Yes, so the second poll should be up. Same rules as before. Please provide 3 answers, check 3 answers to the question, how can we stimulate sustainable biofuel production in developing economies? And I think we've had a lot of suggestion on how that could how that could take place from our speakers. We will wait till those answers come in, and then I assume I see that Jossy Thomas is on the call. Jossy Thomas from UNIDO. If you've seen the other sessions, you know that Jossy is leading efforts for industrial biotechnology and industrial biorefining through the UN Industrial Development Organization, and he will be joining us as an extra panelist. So please, there have been some questions. We have the results. Pretty strong result, which is over 3/4 of participants view suitable financial support mechanisms as fundamental to bringing sustainable biofuel production online in developing countries. That's a broad topic. I think we will drill down on that in some of our questions. Policy support from mandates. We have a related improve access to finance, tech transfer, feasibility studies, connecting stakeholders to the value chain. It seems like most people think that finance and funding mechanisms are necessary to really catalyze action in the developing world. And so we will close that poll. And Jossy, are you with us?
Yes.
Hello, Jossy.
Yeah.
Welcome. Actually, at this point, I think we want everybody to bring their cameras back. Jossy, do you have any initial reactions to what you've just seen? Otherwise, I will move into the questions.
Thank you, Jerry. It has been a wonderful panel of presentations and very informative, especially on the sustainable aviation fuel sector, in addition to cooking and other transportation requirements. Overall, I see, there is the need for decarbonizing transport sector and cooking sector with alternative clean fuels is a necessity, and how we also saw that how emerging economies, developing countries are lagging behind. Even though the demand is so high in those countries also. So there are a lot of initiatives to be done in order to bring them also on board. I think this kind of gatherings is a first step to at least to share where we stand and what informations are available around. So with that, I will leave it to you.
Thank you.
For all this. Yeah.
Thank you, Jossy. Great to see you again. Reiner, we're going to circle back to you. And the first question, which was essentially the recent poll question, which is, and this question I'll ask to all the panelists, what are the greatest obstacles for deployment of sustainable biofuel production in developing countries, and how do we deal with these? I suppose I could also rephrase this as, do you agree that finding finance is the greatest obstacle? And if yes, do you have suggestions for solutions, or can you expand on different aspects of the finance? Are we talking about funding pilot projects? Are we talking about finding CapEx? Are we finding about investors willing to take on the risk? Or are we looking at de-risking mechanisms? I'm curious to your list.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Gerard. I think it will be a bit of everything that you mentioned. No, I was also when these questions were shared, like financing was top notch. So certainly, if you want to pick one single challenge and barrier, that would probably be financing. But in general, we know that when talking about biomass, bioenergy value chains, the whole value chain is the critical issue. You know, like it's we all know it's a bit even more complicated than other renewable energy technologies, no, because you have the link to the agriculture sector, you have a lot of farmers involved, you have outgrower schemes. So the whole value chain, and then basically you have the direct linkage with land use change, with livelihoods of farmers. You know, that is all more complicated. So, but then this is not a good answer, because indeed it makes things even more complicated. But coming back to your financing, I have to admit I was not totally surprised, but Robert, many thanks for highlighting that producing SAF in developing countries is more expensive due to the high costs of money, basically. And that shouldn't be, no, of course, everything should be cheaper. No, the feedstock, you have, the weather is better, the yields are higher, even, okay, the wages are lower. Whether this is good news, I don't know, but but in the end, still, it turns out that the production, I'm not surprised, but it was still like I think this is quite a message. So the cost of money outweighs all the other factors that should be in benefit of developing countries. And so coming back to the financing, and then I'll stop and give room to others. So certainly what is needed, and this is needed all over the world, is support when constructing plants. No, the US is now taking steps. In fact, if you want plants to be built, money on the table always helps. This is true. You know, in Europe we are shying away still a little. You know, so but in the end, if you want things happening, you need lots of money. Even though Robert was saying it's not unprecedented, but lots. But then, and the other aspect with respect to the sort of high numbers, you would also need social support schemes. And Jossy, that was. Is part of what you're implementing in Dar es Salaam. You also need to support the market creation. So to buy a stove is not the same order of magnitude than to build a SAF plant. But still also the smaller amounts are needed to build the market and get the whole value chain rolling. I will stop here. No, it's not everything is said.
Thank you, Rainer. Glaucia, do you have thoughts on barriers? Anything that leaps out at you, whether in Latin America, Africa, or Southeast Asia?
Yeah, no, I think for everyone, not only in these regions, the pendulum effect of policy, where you have policy that is signaling a direction of a mandate of targets, and then suddenly it shifts towards a lower mandate, lower blends, or no policy at all, or a delay. So this has been something that continuously plagues the sector. You see in many countries this change of directions, and I would say that this is a really big impediment.
Do you think that the burden of the policy is necessarily purely at the individual country level, or should policies? How do you think some of the larger countries and their more mature markets, how do you think they should play relative to developing countries or to the global south?
They create a demand, so it's obvious that many countries that are developing their own policies look up to that and see if there is a chance that perhaps we could be exporters. Can we contribute to this larger market? And when Europe, the US, or other regions decide to change directions or to opt for other technologies, it's always something that the media picks up, and we kind of get contaminated. Should we not be doing this? And I think this is repeatedly been emphasized in this emerging economies that we have to have solutions that consider the local context, our possibilities, our feedstock resources, and the legislation. So if we have all of this in place, we should be more resilient to these changes. But it is a global market, and we see all these countries participating now, not all, but many, in the SAF discussions as well. So this will impact decisions that are made for these developed regions, of course, impact the global market.
Well, speaking of SAF, Robert and Megersa, your response to, or should I say, not that you necessarily represent the entire World Bank group, but anything you can add in terms of emerging strategies within the bank, perceptions in the bank around creating a more enabling financing environment. Anything you might want to add to that would be spectacular. And then there was a question around whether the World Bank Group is offering parallel support initiatives for other fuels besides SAF, such as clean cooking. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. Yes, we are looking into alternative fuels for maritime transport. And the cooking part is actually a very interesting surprise to me. I'm from Ethiopia and I know how this fuel is used for cooking and all of that. But in my work on SAF, it never crossed my mind that it's also competing with SAF.
No, I think, sorry for that. Sorry to be clear. I think that the liquid fuel in mind there was ethanol. It was not using kerosene.
I see.
No, I don't think that would be a competitive situation. No, the question I think is, well, I mean, I could just phrase it this way. Are there fuels that are there other fuels besides SAF that the World Bank is supporting? And you said maritime, so that's interesting.
Right.
And then if you could then elaborate on anything that you can share in terms of the strategy or the tactics that the bank is taking to bring production of those high value fuels, SAF and maritime, to market.
Yes, of course, the priority on aviation and maritime is because these are the two hard to decarbonize and abate sectors, right? And I heard the term used earlier for the whole transport sector, but aviation and maritime will be the hardest to abate. For road transport, e-mobility is becoming a viable option. But for maritime and aviation, I guess all the available biofuel should be, I think, I'm an aviation person, that's what I think. But at the same time, we are also looking into green hydrogen-based fuels. The technology is not ready at least commercial scale for aviation. But we are trying some pilot studies, especially for maritime, including South Africa. Maybe more generally on the financing question, I wanted to also react on that. A key will be, at least from SAF perspective, is a long-term offtake agreement, right? Robert showed a map earlier. Most of the current SAF is being used in California and Western Europe. And this happens because there is a good policy environment, climate policy environment. And then one good example recently is the biggest SAF producer currently is Neste. This is an oil refinery company based in Finland, which is producing SAF in Singapore using feedstock collected from the region and selling it in California.
Yes.
So
it's a bizarre situation. I mean, I think that a significant fraction of beef tallow from Australia ends up fueling lorries and trucks in California, which is very strange. But yeah, so those are some of the players. We're curious as to the route forward and tools that the World Bank might bring to bear.
Indeed, and of course, the fact that Neste is collecting this feedstock from the region actually is a good one, right? That's maybe some developing countries cannot join the full production of SAF, but they can participate in the supply of feedstock. One final example from me, I heard from BP, British Petroleum, that they are producing agricultural feedstock in Argentina and selling it, bringing it to the US again for further processing to produce SAF as well. That is also one option.
I don't know if they're producing SAF, but certainly Eni, the Italian oil company, is looking to bring vegetable oil feedstocks to Europe, and you know, as I think that a lot of these companies have in mind that we have to start somewhere in terms of driving the investment into creating the supply chain, right? So
That's right.
So it's very difficult to just de novo put up a €500 million biorefinery in the global south without a feedstock supply chain. So one could imagine the effort of fleshing out the supply chain, bringing the supplies to a given port, and then instead of shipping it, you actually just put in a biorefinery at the port. But it's not a bad strategy to start by building out the supply chain. Did you want to say anything to that, Megersa? We can go to your partner, Robert.
Yes, just of course, that becomes a problem where the demand is somewhere else, right? But ideally, if you want to sell whatever you produce locally to save on environmental footprints, right? In the case of South Africa, we just heard from Farai, they have everything in place. I always say they have the technology, Sasol perfected the power to liquid, coal to liquid technology, and they have everything. But at the end of the day, if you don't have a very good off-taker in the local market, then you struggle. As you know, South African Airways has been struggling for many years. And so the aim in South Africa is to export this somewhere instead of using it locally. And for that, you need a very good policy environment. And I understand there is something new developing as I've been chatting with Farai on the side. I stop here and let Robert also chime in.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, with regard to Megersa's last point, I think that's a very, very good one. I mean, South Africa was an early mover on SAF feasibility studies. And indeed, all the components are there, but for the offtake side, right? And it seems, well, given that all the other components are there, that a good offtake agreement with a strong local partner that also has the volumes, can guarantee a large chunk of the volumes that this biorefinery would produce is, well, a precondition for anything, right? Because, Farai, maybe I'm wrong, but we've not heard anything concrete in the last, I don't know, 24 months or so, right? Like that we go from this feasibility stage to a, well, an announcement that a facility will be built. And there is a learning from that, and that is the offtake. That means that, well, that there's hope actually for other emerging markets, because luckily the situation of SAA is not, there are a lot of cash-strapped airlines around in emerging markets, but some others are actually not as cash-strapped. Well, coming back to the question.
Well, I mean, sorry, Robert, on that point, of course, I mean, Delta Airlines, British Airways, I mean, British Airways flies like 4 flights a day from London to South Africa. I'm just,
but
I mean, and they're super engaged in the UK. So I'm just wondering, maybe we need to call our friends at the IAG group.
Well, that gets me to the second point.
Okay,
so the UK, why it's like we coordinated this beforehand, which we did not. So why is IAG so engaged in the UK? Well, it's obviously because there's the mandate, right? That will come. So I am not sure that, and that might be a controversial comment, make it anyway. I'm not sure that the mandates and the incentives in the US and the mandates in Europe are necessarily a good thing for accelerated deployment and SAF in developing and emerging economies. Because all the effort at this point from the players that have the financial resources goes towards first fulfilling the mandates or make use of the large tax incentives in their home markets, right? So if I'm British Airways, why should I do anything in South Africa if I have to make sure that I fulfill the volume requirements by 2030 in the UK? And the same you see for US carriers, you see the same you see for continental European carriers. In the long term,
it's more expensive, no, Robert, and it's more expensive, as you showed. No?
But and it is, yes, and it is more expensive, and it is more risky. So it might even come with a penalty. I do not know if that interpretation is correct in the medium to the long term, right? Because it will also lead. So the deployment that we now see in some developed markets will lead to faster learning, right? Faster going to scale. Driving down costs, and that obviously can then benefit developments in emerging and developing economies as well. But I do believe now in this inception phase that the pull from these mandates and these incentives in these two major aviation markets might actually be detrimental for developing and emerging economies.
Okay, we're going to go to Farai because we've been talking about his home country long enough without him, but I'm not sure I understand exactly why it's detrimental. So if you could just take 30 seconds to repeat why you think it's detrimental, and then we'll go to Farai.
Because financial resources are limited, right? These are big investments. Offtake commitments that airlines can make are limited because these fuels also in developed countries are much more expensive. I think it's very simple in this regard.
Yeah, I see. So it's sort of a bandwidth, like the airlines don't have the demand bandwidth to also incentivize, but that's when you would hope that, you know, the international community might find a way to liberate voluntary carbon markets in some way to drive this forward. So like you know, we sitting here could like sketch out on a whiteboard in 15 minutes how it should play out, and maybe we should do that and deliver it to the bank. But before wants to jump in, and then
I think that's a good connection with the follow-up question. So I think it's important to contextualize before we hear Farai that, I mean, we hear a lot of this potential in the developing countries. So this is, I would say, to be tapped, if you like. Basically, we will need that anyway if you want to go to the 1.5C. So I think there is a nice strategy that we start to develop those markets, right? I mean, collectively. And there is this idea of how we can have the support from international community. So I think that there is a role here for, let's say, the World Bank, right, or other institutions on reducing this cost that was presented here. So there is an additional cost that is risk related to the country. And the resources are there. So what to be done? And by the way, if we do not manage to do that in the SAF, that is an international market, how we will be doing that in other markets? So with that, of course, this is also connected with the attraction of private investment, private capital to those markets. And maybe Farai would be good to hear from you also about that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. I think it's been a really interesting discussion so far, you know, particularly with regards to South Africa. I think I'll start off by saying certainly, you know, policy certainty is quite key, and you're seeing the major movements in most of these developed countries has been, you know, a good policy push, which has been quite different from what we've been facing here in South Africa. I mean, when you're talking about SAF, even our biofuels framework is not that sound and that solid. It was developed way back in the early 2000s, but up to now, we've got provisions for blending of biofuels, but that hasn't happened yet. So, I mean, it's those things that's challenging. Now, when you start at least talking about SAF, it's a huge leap, right? So it's a lot of work that needs to go there. And when it comes to SAF, what you've seen is this opportunity is not quite understood yet. You know, we can't put ethanol in our cars for 2% or 4.5%. Now we want to put green fuels in aviation. And of course, given some of the safety standards around aviation and what it means, people are quite skeptical, say, are you now putting, ethanol molecules and just understanding that scenario. So that's some of the work that we've been done to put the SAF opportunity out there and what exactly it is. And we've seen this changing in the recent past with the work that we've done, highlighting this opportunity and seeing government now coming on board to say, we need to start thinking more deeply about this opportunity it presents for South Africa. I think IRENA raised an important point at the beginning that for development countries, there needs to be a why that is being done. And in developing countries, for South Africans' case, with the high unemployment rate, I think to provide jobs and is quite a big key component in energy security. So those are some of those things that you need to lead into to get on board. So, with this ongoing process now for developing a SAF roadmap, laying the right policy in place, getting the different partners and everyone across the value chains, I think is an important step point. The second issue I also stressed before around the value chains and the biomass to actually get it to where you need to be. That's a massive challenge, specifically when you're talking about these invasive alien plants, which are highlighted, or even with the SAA scenario, or the SAA work 5 years ago, where they did the trials. It was a simple plot of land which was then extracted in South Africa, but shipped to the United States to be processed, and then it had to come back to South Africa and fly between Johannesburg and Cape Town. So how do we do that, and demonstrate those supply chains on a larger scale? Perhaps there's a role now for financiers like the World Bank to help us set up those more concrete and fixed supply chains to take this forward, to say, how can we move forward? I think there's plenty of opportunities. There are plenty of opportunities to tap into degraded mining land, for instance, given South Africa's history in mining, etc. So quite a lot of opportunities. It is unfortunate that we don't have a strong, I would say, national carrier, given the challenges that SAA has faced previously. But I think South Africa is still well placed, particularly OR Tambo Johannesburg Airport, I think, to a point, Gerard, about the amount of international airlines that fly there. And almost all of them have a SAF commitment. And that commitment is, say, you're going to take SAF, right? And in some cases, that it should not really matter where you got it from. So you've got United Airlines, British Airways, Emirates, you name them, they're flying into South Africa. Air France, KLM, almost on a daily basis. And you see there's this opportunity now where we need to look at to move this industry together. Then we have to be more collaborative approach, even from the airlines themselves, because now we've got the demand, but it wouldn't work from a single airline business. But how can, like, let's say, an association of international airlines with SAF ambitions work in South Africa to secure this and move forward? So that could be an option. Another option would be to look more clearly and the issue around book and claim systems. How can we do that? I know there are challenges when people think about how can we go about this. In South Africa, we've got one of the busiest air routes in South Africa, between Johannesburg and Cape Town, two major cities, 1,500 kilometers apart. If you want to travel in between them, you have no option but to fly. So, how can we make use of local airlines that are flying out every 10, 20 minutes between Johannesburg and Cape Town, use those for, SAF certificates and then sell those elsewhere? That's how we can get SAF in the system. So I think we need to think about that instead of, and see how we can do those things better to get it up and running. And then lastly, in terms of around legislation and around the SASO issue, I'm not defending them here, but one of the challenges has been well publicized around the issue of co-processing and flexible allocation and things like that in the EU, and whether or not that is accepted. In terms of looking from a developmental perspective and looking at a case-by-case basis, and SASO being the only facility like that in the world, perhaps it's an opportunity to rethink that and to say, how can that be adapted more to open up markets in the EU, for instance, and get SAF quickly onto the market. So, those are the things that we can make up, and I'm sure if we follow those, this tapped potential that we talk about in South Africa, we can really get there within the next, I would say, 2-3 years.
Ricardo, your question.
Yeah, I think that there is a very interesting opportunity here for the international community. You know, I would like to stress that further, maybe some regional blends instead of as we try to concentrate where the risk is lower, but maybe we can try to think about some regional blends maybe. And following that, maybe Glaucia would like to bring your views about that. And then Rainer, yeah, let's hear
So
then. Please.
it seems to be the blending mandate seems to be the easiest, most straightforward, and one of the most used approaches to get started. It can like warm up the system to more extensive goals. Task 39 every year has an implementation agenda report that updates on this. So I would cite that as a good document to follow up on what's happening regarding the blending. And I would also like to mention something that I saw in the Q&A that we didn't talk much here, but the possibilities of adding this strategies as a biorefinery approach. So we don't as much think of one particular product, but we start to use all fractions of biomass to some processing routes. I will cite this recent development in Brazil, which is you use the vinasse that used to be a problem. It's an outcome of the ethanol distillation process. It is rich in organic matter, and it usually is put back into the field as fertigation, increasing yields and recycling nutrients. And recently, the excess of vinasse through the concentration technologies is being used to produce biogas. And then you can, from that, go into biomethane. And this is feeding the trucks and greening the fleets, which, if anyone saw the life cycle analysis, most of the emissions are on the field side of things, on the planting and harvesting. So greening the fields through the use of trucks, this is a market that is expanding now, using biomethane. And biomethane also opens other venues for exploration, which is you can transform it into hydrogen, biohydrogen, and you can make bio ammonia. So you can make green ammonia. So this would also help green and even neutralize. So we are talking almost carbon neutrality by adding just like this one route. And for carbon capture, then one last aspect in a biorefinery approach, you have almost pure CO2 streams coming out of the fermentation process. If you can capture that, and there is catalysts being developed, there is a pilot study already in development to transform that pure CO2 into biomethanol and perhaps even bioethanol. So I think there will be multiple possibilities, creating a market where you can bring added revenue so that there is some leg room for improvements, and trying to define where the most inefficiencies are so we can tackle them. I think will be very important, and we can promote even more ambitious blends. So we can go that route as well.
Thank you. No, I think it's important, this aspect of the technology. I would like also to stress a bit further this international community, how we can have help from international community, especially on the risk mitigation. I think this is related to what we have been discussing before on the off-taker, and also as you mentioned, what are the opportunities there in terms of the blend. So maybe Rainer, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, no, many thanks, Ricardo. I will partly answer your question and partly say something else, but maybe on the off-taker issue. No, this is very clear, and it does make the sustainable aviation fuel market interesting. No, because we are talking about single off-takers, which is almost the opposite to the clean cooking fuel for Jossy. You know, where you need to work with all the different households, each single one buying a few liters. You know, so this is what does make sense basically when promoting sustainable aviation fuels. I did want to take a step back and follow up on policies. My last intervention was financing, now policies. Actually, one of the main outcomes from our study for UNIDO was that if a country, a developing country, would decides basically to set up a program, you know, in the field of bioenergy or biofuels, the first point would be to identify the policy drivers. You know, what is it exactly that we want to achieve with that? And then there is a number of issues, like could be health, deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions, import dependence, job creation was mentioned now a few times. And this, I think, is very important. And it brings me back to supporting also the clean cooking applications of ethanol. As much as I do understand that, especially in Europe now, we have passed the ethanol and biodiesel. I saw a few comments in the chat also. You know, we think all this is stupid, was a long time ago, and also is not sustainable. And now we are moving to the hard to abate sectors, and we will electrify public transport. This is correct. I believe this is fine. I'm just not sure whether this will happen in the same speed in developing countries, and whether or not in the upcoming decades it does make sense actually to use ethanol as even as a first generation fuel, which is totally no-go in Europe, even talking about it, I think, and to exploit the benefits of a blending program with a few percentages plus a clean cooking programs that could complement and act as a market, more complicated market than single airlines. Only you have to convince them. But so basically the target would be really also to help your societies by improving, by contributing to clean cooking services. My view would be that for a lot of countries that should be a higher priority than some. I'm sorry, but let's be a little controversial here. And maybe can I give the word to Jossy, because you're currently implementing an ethanol cooking program in Dar es Salaam. Is it proceeding well? Sorry, sorry. Thank you.
Please, yes.
Thank you, Ricardo, and thank you, Rainer. You know, when we talk about how international community can help in promoting biofuels in developing countries, I would start with, you know, even though most of the developing countries have a good renewable energy policy framework by this time, if you go deep, they just scratching the surface in terms of biofuels, because many of the policymakers in developing countries have a fear in their back of mind about how this will affect, biofuels will affect the food security in those countries. So that is a very genuine concern, but it is also a misconception. So I think there is a big role international research institutions and international agencies can do is to alleviate that misunderstanding that the fuel and food can be synergetic in a country, especially those countries who are depending on agricultural sector. It is an opportunity to to stimulate the agriculture sector and the industry sector for processing and meeting the demand, energy demand in the country in terms of clean cooking or in the aviation fuel or the road, the surface transport, wherever, they can use that product, and in that process they can stimulate their an overall economic empowerment, create jobs, save a lot of foreign exchange by avoiding importation of fossil fuels, etc. So there are a lot of opportunities. So international agencies and institutions can help in that area. In addition, I think there is also a need for sharing of experiences from various countries, and that's why Glaucia's presentation was very, very useful in this context, where they have, the IEA task force has been studying on various countries. These are very valuable experience to share with to developing countries, and also networking agencies like IEA Bioenergy, Biofuture platforms, the Council on Clean Cooking, and GBEP, etc. So they all can be a platform to share this experience and experience among the countries. Then another aspect is, of course, South-South cooperation, or is key because many countries like Brazil, India, Thailand, all these are advanced countries in terms of biofuel production, and their technologies may be more cost-effective for developing countries and contextual. So I believe for international agencies to promote South-South cooperation in this area is also very, very important. So these are some of the issues where agencies can help in promoting a biofuel industry creation and its value chain development in developing countries.
Thank you very much. Well, before giving you the floor, Gerard, just to ask Megersa and also Robert their views on this international community help. What any new idea here that we would like to bring to our attention?
If I may go first. I think we started from a climate perspective, right? And then these discussions for me usually then quickly become about industrial policies at the end of the day. And when it comes to industrial policies, it's hard to have a universal goal, right? Every country competes based on its comparative advantage, and then the climate question sort of disappears at the background. And I think earlier Robert was saying these mandates and incentives, they help develop certain industry in certain parts of the world, and solving the climate problem to some extent, but at the grand scheme of things, they might not necessarily help, right? But from the World Bank side, specifically talking about climate finance for these kind of activities, our climate finance department has a results-based financing scheme where financing is provided based on significant emission reductions. They are looking into around 1 million tons equivalent reduction in emissions for projects, where they fund projects based on emission reductions. They also have a serious requirement in terms of how to account for these emissions. There needs to be a well-verified MRV scheme, MRV in place to be able for them to disperse their funding. I can post a link for that here, and it can apply to some of the things we have heard here. And for specifically for SAF, I understand there is an effort now to modify the grid model. I saw it in one of the presentations. I think it was from Glaucia somewhere or from Rainer. The grid was in one of their presentations, but that is mostly used for other modes of transport. It's not well developed to account for emission reductions for aviation, but it's being developed, I understand, by DOE and FAA to be used for their new IRA tax incentive schemes. And the World Bank is interested in that. Maybe some of that model could be developed globally and used for these results-based climate financing to support developing countries. Robert.
Yeah, Megersa, thank you. Just adding precisely to this point, because I believe it is an important one, the results-based financing by international development banks. This is an opportunity for the biofuel sector in general, given that we're talking large investment, large facilities that do contribute or achieve these significant emission reductions that are required in order to qualify under these programs. There's also a particular opportunity actually for SAF in the sense that we have the CORSIA system under which SAF that would be used for international aviation would qualify under CORSIA for not only a monetary credit that's relatively small, but more important in the context of this result-based financing, you would have the MRV system baked in there, and it's by international agreement. So you would not need to reinvent the wheel here, which you might need to do if we're talking about domestic biofuel production, where you need to set up an MRV system in the local economy, in the host country of this refinery. Whereas for CORSIA, you would not need to do that, or for sustainable aviation fuel, you would not need to do that because CORSIA has an MRV system in place. So just
sorry, Robert,
yeah.
just could you remind us what MRV stands for again?
It is monitoring, verification, and what's the R actually, Megersa?
Results.
Reporting or results.
Yeah. It's basically you make sure that whatever you bring in, you should have brought in, and it's credited at the right amount. It's the governance of the system.
The chat says verification, so we'll go with monitoring.
Yes, and verification, yes, and then there's an R in between.
For reporting, I think.
Reporting,
okay.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Okay,
good. Thank you. So you're saying that the World Bank has a evidence performance-based fund or program, or how would you describe this?
So I shared the link for everybody here,
okay.
Yeah. So depending on the project, are you resulting in, as I said, maybe a minimum of 1 million tons equivalent reduction in carbon
per annum,
yeah, per annum. And then if you have in place a very good MRV system that everybody agrees on, then the bank could provide financing. Yeah, you will see examples of this. It has happened largely in the energy sector, solar panels, and yeah, you know why that's happening.
Well,
right.
That's where the volume is, right? And if you're, it's appropriate to set a threshold for impact. You could spend a bunch of time on 10,000 tons, but you could spend a similar amount of time on 1 million tons. So I understand why you're taking that approach.
Yeah, the bank is original approach was mentioned by Jossy earlier. I heard it also before. I think you can aggregate these savings across regions, but then you need to cooperate a lot. And the bank is now trying to support public transport service providers in developing countries to under a facility where they can maybe approach us. So 10 buses in Burkina Faso, 11 buses in Addis are not going to cut it, right? If they can aggregate this demand, maybe they could qualify for this financing. Yeah. The same for SAF and other sectors as well.
Well, Ricardo, I'm going to take the liberty. I'm going to jump in on this international coordination discussion.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, right. So you know, yeah. So we here discussing this now are making some linkages, drawing some, you know, creating some ideas of future work. And this is really the purpose for a lot of multinational forums, right? So this is actually why things like the Global Bioenergy Partnership exists, why IRENA exists, why the G20 exists, and why things like the Clean Energy Ministerial exist. Now, and so I think that I know that a lot of these international agencies are routinely in touch, but I think that they're feeling the urgency. They're feeling that they're sensing the opportunity, and then a lot is going to get done. And I think that we owe IEA Bioenergy TCP a lot of credit for bringing us together with representatives for everywhere from UNIDO to the World Bank. And so this is really a productive discussion, and we owe the TCP a lot of credit. The problem is that we all understand bioenergy. And we need to go the next step, is we need to go outside the system's boundaries of the bioeconomy system, and we need to engage with new players and new activities. And an idea that has come forward in a variety of places is the idea that, as you probably know, even in OECD countries, ministries of agriculture and ministries of energy are not necessarily coordinating. You know, so for example, I'm in the UK at the moment and was
not even friends, Gerard, in some places.
Sorry?
Not even friends.
Oh no! Well, I haven't even mentioned Ministry of Environment and Climate yet, have I? No. And so if we take, for example, I'm in the UK at the moment. You take, for example, the UK, SAF is being managed by the Ministry of Transport. Do I believe strongly that the Ministry of Transport is aligned with the Ministry of Agriculture? No. And so there's a variety of catalytic functions that I think the international community can play. One is to break down barriers between agencies. So for example, in developing countries on the bioeconomy, the UN FAO has a standing program where they enable cross-ministry discussion in a variety of countries. And so that's one tool that we have to drive this forward. But really what we need to do is we need to leverage the convening power of our international partners. We need to leverage the convening power of the African Union. We need to leverage the convening power of the G20, et cetera, to pull together, for example, people from the investment side and people from the business side together with the international technical agencies so well represented here, and NGOs, private sector, et cetera. So those broader coalitions, and actually, Robert, I was motivated to talk about this by your slide that talks about the need for coalition building. And something that I would say that we see in the biofuel space is the fact that we have, we have industry coalitions, we have NGO coalitions, we have intergovernmental coalitions, and they are all very busy and they're all doing good work, but we need to find some leadership that's going to break down some of those barriers or generate some alignment. So that's my 2 cents, and I'll go another round on the next question, which is pushing forward then on, well, I think we've answered this to some extent. The question is, how do we motivate private finance, right? And so if we're talking about bringing in private finance, then what we're talking about, I think, is largely stable policies, de-risking, and then creating multiple revenue streams so that there is a profit at the end of the day. You know, even if the profit is a small one, the private sector can figure out how to leverage that. So I'm just wondering, perhaps I've answered the question, but I'm just wondering if anybody has anything they want to. I'll say it this way: does anybody have anything they want to add to that? Because we've largely specified what it would take. Something we haven't talked about much is either obligatory or voluntary carbon markets. And so is there anybody that wants to, I'll go in reverse order. So I can start with Farai and say Farai has either obligatory or voluntary carbon markets. Do you see that activity in South Africa now? And is it relevant to either ethanol for cooking or SAF?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it could be, but again, with any mandates, I mean, one has to be careful about that, right? When you put mandate, you'd want that to be at least achievable or within reach. And I've given the example of the mandates that we have for ethanol blending in South Africa that have been there for the last 10 or so years. But if you go to any fuel pump station in South Africa, you're not going to get that blended. So the blended mandate is there, but it hasn't done anything to move the needle. So I think a better focus on other initiatives to see how we can get that private sector investment in another form. Going back to the things that you've mentioned around policy etc, to push that investment forward. Maybe once we've reached that stage where we've got something on the market and now we want to increase ambition, then we can start thinking about mandates. But it could be very risky to start with mandates off the ground because they might actually be a barrier for anything to get started, as we have seen the case in South Africa.
Okay. I'm going to let Ricardo.
May I ask why Farai did the mandates block anything? No, I can recall that biofuel mandates were discussed 10-15 years ago. I was in the project, but not the mandates blocked it. No, I can't believe. It's just nobody took the steps, or maybe the incentives were not high enough. No, but
yeah,
we agree it was not the mandate was the fault.
Yeah, it was not the mandate. It was the incentives were not high enough. The support for feedstock producers, the capital subsidies, and so forth. So just to prove to say you can have a mandate, but it won't do anything to shift the needle if you don't have practical, other supporting mechanisms to move forward.
No, because in fact the sugar industry they would have been interested, to produce some ethanol from vinasses and do some, but only didn't pay off. No, yeah.
It would be.
Speaking for the U.S. perspective, if you're going to have a mandate, you have to be willing to put people in jail if they break the law. And in the United States, people have committed fraud, people have gone to jail. But it takes a lot of political will and a lot of support from society to actually do that. And so so your point, Farai, on the whether mandates are the way to go in a new market, it's tough. And so and actually my understanding is, at least for SAF in Europe, there's a lot of hesitancy around mandates because then people fear that they're just going to follow what is obligatory, and they're not actually going to take the time and invest in the long-term, full-blown solutions. At this point, it is almost 2.5 hours. And so I think we're going to bring in Luc Pelkmans and Ricardo. If you have any closing words, I'm going to sign off now and I'm going to say thank you, everybody. I really appreciate this. I think we've had a lot of good ideas and we'll be following up, but I'm happy to hand off to Ricardo, Luc, and Jossy. Thank you.
Yeah, just thank you everyone as well. And I think we are out of time, so please, Luc, back to you.
Thanks very much. I think this was a great discussion. I think we had 3 great sessions also yesterday and today with all presentations. We had, I think, deliberately also we foresee quite some time for the discussions from the panel to really have time to discuss things a little bit in depth so we can move things. And that's also what we hope that with this initiative and also with people talking to each other, organizations getting in touch with each other, that we can move things. And that's in the end, that's also we as IEA Bioenergy, as an international organization bringing together experts from all over the world, is the impact in the end is that we want to move something and that we want to actually facilitate sustainable bioenergy, and hope that this pushes in the right direction. I'm not going to summarize everything which has been said in the 3 sessions. So I think we've looked pretty broadly, going from really energy access in the first session, really the smaller scale. In the second session, looking at opportunities for biomass supply. I'm a little bit concerned now if everything is just looked at it from a climate perspective, because what we discussed in the second session is that there are so many win-win opportunities. So really, particularly on improving air quality, it's really a tremendous effort that we can, and an impact that we can have there. Yeah, methane emissions, but of course that falls on the climate as well. But a lot of these extra opportunities which you have next to climate and energy are also really very important if you look at opportunities for biomass supply in developing economies. And then in the last session, I think great discussions here also. I think we get into a little bit of yeah, compromise or between using things in the small scale for cooking, or really going into international markets for aviation fuels, and something in the middle is if you have a local road transport. So I think we have to keep the eyes open that opportunities are really there, also for the people on the ground, both for producing biomass, but also using the biofuel which can be produced, and certainly these socioeconomic and industry opportunities are also very important. But it also is important that as international organizations, and well, we have put a lot of them on the table in these workshops, that they also try to join forces and try to stimulate things happening also in developing economies, because that's also where we see that a lot of the feedstock is, and a lot of the opportunities will be there. So I think we're moving to the end. So thanks again for all the speakers. Thanks for the moderators for playing a very active role also in these discussions. So we're really happy with the outcomes of this workshop. As mentioned frequently, I think in the Q&A and in the chat, that all the presentations will be made available in the coming days on the webpage of the workshop, the recordings as well. And starting from now, I will also try to summarize what has been presented, what has been discussed. I think it's not going to be such an easy task, but anyway, I will also contact the speakers and the moderators when I have a draft so you have the opportunity to react or put your inputs and comments. So that will be available, we hope, before I would say the summer, but then I'm looking at the northern hemisphere, so looking now more at the southern hemisphere, so probably somewhere in July, I hope. So thanks again, everybody, and yeah, hope to see you in the next occasion. I think we will meet at a certain point as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.